I think it was on Monday that I had Buck Sexton, he's our national security advisor, and I asked him, I said, you know, we're going the way of the Roman Empire. I said, but isn't that what really kind of helped the Ottoman Empire? Isn't that what happened? And I asked him to look into the parallels, and he, of course, did, because he's remarkable. Buck Sexton is here now. Buck, can you take me
yes.
Take me through the parallels and the 5th century of Rome, if you will?
Well, as we were discussing, it was, of course, a Christian empire at that time, and it was divided into two. In fact, I have a map, as I'm fond of doing, in which I could show you just exactly what we're talking about here. This is the Christian world in the 5th century going into the 6th century. Now, what's interesting, of course, is it's broken up into the Western and Eastern empires. Now, Glenn, one of the questions, of course, why was it breaking up, and also how is it eroding from within? Because we know that from here, from the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad and then the first caliphs, the Rashidun caliphs, were able to take this entire Christian area in a very short period of time. Why was that? It was because it eroded from the inside. The Romans had an overextended military. They had debased their currency to pay off their debts. They had a bureaucracy that essentially was living as a parasite on the entirety of the Roman people. It became huge, unwieldy, too many regulations, too many laws. All of a sudden, they were operating only for their own...
Hang on, Buck. I'm having a hard time getting my arms around that. That sounds completely foreign to what we might be facing. I've never heard anything like that.
Where could this ever happen?
Yeah, I know.
So they had that. They also had loss of control over their borders. Now, up from this area coming down, you have the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths. They had forces along here. Limitanae, they were called. They were essentially the border forces, but they were completely overwhelmed by some of the major groups that came in here. They called them barbarians, from a Greek word, actually, for a barbarian. And then you had the Vandals, and they started to take control of these areas, leading up to the eventual fall of Rome. The Eastern Empire lasted longer, but suffered from the same problems. Again, a bureaucracy that was far too big. The erosion of a political culture, Glenn. It no longer meant anything particularly good to be a citizen. It meant that you were subject to capricious laws, to rulers who only existed for their own benefit. Your life was essentially at the whim of outside invaders and outside forces at any point in time, and you had no rights other than excessive taxation and regulation on your life. That's what caused this whole thing to be essentially set up for the complete collapse of this in a very short amount of time.
Okay, so my theory here, Buck, was that we are looking at a time now, much like this, where the entire West is basically the Roman Empire, and when it collapses, it will be just gobbled up and eaten by a new caliphate. Can you take us to take us to what happened then, and I mean the parallels?
Sure. Well, what happens here is, you see, Rome falls, the barbarians essentially take it, and it disintegrates from the power that it was. The Eastern Empire, actually, the Byzantine Empire, with Constantinople as the capital, that lasted a bit longer. But Glenn, as we know, in the 7th century, during the life of the Prophet Muhammad, what was going on in these areas, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, where the Coptic Christians, of course, were first formed, they all were in a state of disarray. They had schisms among each other. They weren't unified ideologically, politically, or otherwise. They were picked off one by one by the first round of by the first caliphate. Now, what's interesting also is that they pushed all the way across here.
Stop. Please repeat what you just said about why the Christians were picked off. Please repeat that.
Well, this is something that's very little known, Glenn. The Christians were actually fighting against each other in a sense. There were some Christians who were willing to work with, particularly on the frontiers, work with the Muslim invaders, if you will, against other Christians. Also, there were schismatics. There were ideological differences that separated these groups in the 5th century, in the 6th century, such as we had all of a sudden these different Christian sects. We had Chaldean Christians, Coptic Christians, Nestorian Christians, and they didn't see each other necessarily.
I bet you they were saying, if I may, in modern language, well, they're not really Christians, we're Christians. And so it doesn't matter, they're not going to, right?
That's exactly right. There was a lot of animosity between these groups. But, Glenn, it fell so quickly. The empire, what had been the greatest empire really in the known world to that point, fell so quickly. And they got as far, just people always forget about this, as Tours in France. Charles Martel in 732 turns back the Cordoban Emirate, which was based out of Spain. They still, by the way, think a lot of hardline Islamists will refer to this place as Andalusia, as Spain as Andalusia. So, no, what's really interesting here is that all these patriarchates, all these major cities, which, by the way, now we, of course, think of as being Muslim. They're not thought of as Christian cities. And many of the cathedrals that weren't burned or destroyed were turned into mosques. These lacked the political unity. They were part of the rot that spread from Rome, essentially, which was, again, this bureaucracy, this destruction of a political culture, such that they were easy prey for the caliphate. They were easy prey for these invaders, and they fell very quickly.
Okay, Buck, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Here's what I want to beg you. Go back and listen to what he just said. History always repeats itself. And we must not be a people who say, well, they're not really Christian, or they're not really this, or they're not really on my side, or, well, they're Jewish and I'm not. Stop it. Stop it. We are going to be picked off one at a time. Oh, well, he's libertarian and I'm more of a social conservative. Stop it. Are you for the freedom of man? Yes or no? It's time to get into the boats together.